Space, the final frontier. Let's do something a little more original. Space is for everybody. That's our new frontier out there, and it's everybody's business to know about space. That was a quote from astronaut Krista McAuliffe. Alright, you heard the lady. Let's learn about space. But what's space like anyway? Here's another quote, this time from physicist Sir Arthur Eddington. The universe is not only stranger than we imagine, it is stranger than we can imagine. And it's about to get even stranger, but it doesn't mean that we have to remain strangers. Hey everybody, my name is D. Who? Exactly. Welcome to my channel D&D Dishes, we're the number 2 when it comes to AD&D 2nd edition content. And today the D stands for... Dude, where's my ship? As we get acquainted with the fantasy space setting, Spelljammer. Picture it. Cruise the calm, vast emptiness of wild space. Take a cigarette break in the phlogiston. A chance encounter with an unknown ship could spell the start of an epic adventure. And whether Star Wars, Trek, or Ocean is your jam, you'll find a home amongst the stars. And we leave as soon as I find my ship. This is Spelljammer AD&D in Space, released in October 1989, merely 6 months after the launch of AD&D 2nd edition. It was the first campaign setting released for 2nd edition. Spelljammer quickly became a fan favorite, with zany creativity that was literally out of this world, and left such a lasting legacy on D&D, which its 5th edition relaunch in 2022 couldn't even do justice. Today, we're breaking open the original box, examine its contents, its history, and attempt to understand why this setting was so beloved. And at the same time, taking off the rose-tinted glasses and giving it the critical eye to see how it holds up 35 years later. Wow, has it really been 35 years? 1989 was a different time. Countries around the world are about to enter a recession, there's a new edition of Dungeons & Dragons, and Madonna's threatening to release a new album. Okay, maybe not that different. By 1989, space travel was already an old duck. Star Trek and Star Wars had both been around for over a decade. AD&D already had a spaceship in Expedition to the Barrier Peaks from 1980. But Spelljammer's point of difference lies with its unique take on space travel, with its genre rooted firmly in fantasy, not science fiction.
Take your run-of-the-mill D&D game. Think medieval European Tolkien-esque with elves and whatnot vanilla fantasy. Imagine the party finds an old ship in some ruin. Then during downtime, the wizard decides to muck around pretending to be the captain of the ship, sits on the helm while giving out orders. Then, out of nowhere, the ship lifts off into the air and continues to ascend until, surprise, you're in space. Yet, the party is still able to breathe. They don't freeze to death, and they can visit the stars with full control of the ship with magic. That is fantasy space. Welcome to Spelljammer. Spelljammer was conceived during a business lunch in Lake Geneva circa 1988, where the designers of TSR pitched ideas to their bosses on the lineup of next year's products. Jeff Grubb, who recently completed the Forgotten Realms campaign setting with Ed Greenwood, wanted to push the envelope on fantasy. Picture this, a knight standing on the deck of a ship, in space. He's not protected from outer space and doesn't freeze. The pitch was simple, D&D in space. Another idea which came out of this meeting was a Dragonlance box set to expand on the other side of Krynn. Veteran designer David Zeb Cook was also in attendance, you know, the guy who wrote a little book called Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition, maybe you've heard of it. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, since I don't have any Dragonlance experience, I guess I'm stuck with D&D in space. And his boss, Jim Ward, said, Zeb, because you don't have any experience with Dragonlance, this is a great place to start. And with that, homework was assigned. Jeff almost didn't get to do the idea that he came up with. Working in corporate is tough, huh? And that's how Jeff got to do AD&D in space, and Zeb went on to produce Dragonlance Time of the Dragons. But do remember this moment, it's gonna come up later.
I've seen a lot of Spelljammer retrospectives where the writer claimed that the primary purpose for this setting was for TSR to bridge together their different campaign settings. But 1988 Advanced Dungeons & Dragons had Greyhawk, Dragonlance, and Forgotten Realms as the 3 main settings. Karator was also known as Oriental Adventures, was an extension of the realms, hence not considered a separate world. But Jeff has spoken about the origin of Spelljammer probably hundreds of times, including in the foreword in this very box set, and the story has never changed. His goal was to take AD&D into space. That has always been the primary objective of this setting, but being able to cross between established worlds was a convenient and welcome bonus. Now the Dragonlance geeks and the Forgotten Realms nerds can finally bury the hatchet and play together. In theory, at least.
Jeff was allotted 2 96-page books, 4 color poster maps, and a bunch of cardboard and was told to fill all that space.
We're going to take a look at this content later in the video, but right now I need to explain the concepts introduced in this setting and narratively just how Jeff's vision is realized.
Spelljammer, the name of the setting, have 3 definitions. Spelljammer, a noun, refers to a vehicle, often some type of ship, with the capacity to sail across space. The Spelljammer, formal noun, is the name of the legendary ship set to roam space. It is often compared to the Flying Dutchman, which is a real-life folklore of legendary ghost ship from the 17th century. Spelljamming, a verb, refers to the act of sailing through space with a spelljammer. Jammer is named after Windjammer, a commercial sailing ship used during the 19th century, and spell means magic, hence spelljammer is effectively a magic ship. A spelljammer could technically be almost anything, but it's usually a ship of some type. Different races and cultures have different ideas on what makes an adequate spacefaring craft, and later on we'll introduce some surprising choices on what's considered spaceworthy. How about a pyramid? A blowfish? You could technically turn even an outhouse into a spelljammer if it's big enough.
So how does it work? Well, it's all powered by the spelljamming helm. Here's one I prepared earlier. How do I look?
Don't listen to him, he's an idiot. The helm actually refers to the captain's seat, could be anything from a chair to a throne. This enchanted helm converts magical energy into kinetic force, which powers the spelljammer. As it requires specifically magical energy, only spellcasters, namely wizards and priests, may use it. Hybrid classes like rangers and paladins may use the helm once they are able to cast spells, but the higher level spellcasters are more proficient at piloting the spelljammer.
Plus, it provides protection against helmet hair. During takeoff, government regulations require that I show you the following safety video. Enjoy your flight.
In space, spelljammers and large bodies have its own gravity in the direction that is most convenient. For most spelljammers, it's often across a horizontal plane. But beware, this plane is two-directional, meaning in the event of a capsize, you may walk firmly on the bottom of the ship's hull. In the event of contact with another body, the gravity plane of the larger body will override the smaller body, hence exercise extreme caution while operating on the deck. You'll be happy to know that bodies in space carry an air envelope. Most spelljammers have sufficient air to sustain life for 4 months. In the event of an emergency, there is no need to fear the vacuum. Everybody has a personal air pocket providing 5 hours of air supply while you wait for rescue.
5 hours? In a vacuum? I thought older editions were supposed to be deadly. That's deodorant. I was meant to do that to freshen up my air supply.
In space, air quality degrades over time from fresh to foul to deadly. Spelljammers provide 4 months of fresh air, then another 4 months of fouled air, which carries a -2 penalty to attack rolls and ability checks. When the air turns deadly, one must save against death each turn to fall unconscious, and a second fail causes death. To freshen up one's air supply, whether for the spelljammer or personal air, one must come into close contact with another air pocket. Typically, spelljammers will make pit stops on celestial bodies to replenish air and other supplies regularly. Celestial bodies refers to planetoids and asteroids, and other massive conglomerates which could include the sun.
Whoa, I'd rather not go to the sun. Deodorant's extremely flammable. Let's just hang around space for a bit. Speaking of, the moment of truth, this is what space looks like.
Once the spelljammer ascends above the planet's atmosphere pocket, you are now in an airless void called wild space. Wild space is encased inside a crystal shell or crystal sphere. Using real-life astronomy as comparison, contained within a crystal sphere is a solar system. And given the fantasy setting, it could be a heliocentric system, meaning the planets orbit the sun like our own solar system, or it could be a geocentric system, meaning the sun and other planets orbit the Earth, inspired by medieval belief that the Earth is at the center of the universe. There are even more esoteric systems such as flat Earth planets or the world turtle cosmology from Hindu mythology, where the crystal sphere is carried by 4 elephants standing on the back of an astronomically sized turtle. The design team took plenty of inspiration on medieval ideas of space and celestial bodies. In particular, Jeff was inspired by this image depicting the Earth being encased in a crystal sphere. Lying beyond are the heavens and myriad of celestial bodies.
Jeff thought this image originated from medieval woodcuts, but it ended up being the cover of The Discoverers by Daniel Buston in the late 1800s. but it was the idea that counts. Hey, it was tough living pre-internet times, okay?
Inside the crystal sphere usually contain a planetary system of celestial bodies. The body at the center of the planetary system, called the primary, lies in the center of the sphere. In our solar system, this will be the sun, and the other celestial bodies generally orbit the primary. The crystal sphere has a radius that is twice as big as the outermost planet of the system. In our solar system, the outermost planet was Pluto. Remember, this was written in 1989. Pluto represents the halfway point between our sun, the primary, and the edge of the crystal sphere. The crystal shell is made of an unbreakable dark material of unknown origin. It is possible for individuals or spelljammers to travel through the shell. Some methods include a teleport or dimension door spell, a phase door spell, which is like the dimension door for spelljammers, naturally occurring portals in the shell which appears randomly, other high-level spells, magic items, divine intervention, or DM buffoonery.
Okay, we're pretty far from home, and is that a portal opening up? Alright crew, it's now or never. We're going through. Phew, that was an intense 4 seconds. Now what do I see?
Well, this. It is called the phlogiston. This word refers to both this region of untamed space between the crystal spheres as well as the multicolored misty fluorescent substance which permeates the space. This is also sometimes referred to as the flow. The flow is somewhere between a gas and a liquid, as its density varies in different regions but is not made of any of the 4 elements. It is also highly flammable.
Alright, safety inspection, life jackets, check. Cranium rats infestation cleaned up, very good. What's this? You're missing a no smoking sign.
Phlogiston is inspired by a real-life scientific theory proposed by alchemist Johann Joachim Becker in 1667. It was theorized that phlogiston was a fire-like element contained in flammable material released upon combustion. The phlogiston theory was eventually debunked, but outdated science from the 1600s is totally on theme for Spelljammer. When exposed to any flames, the flame immediately expands to triple the size and combusts spontaneously. A lit candle does 1d6 damage to a 4-inch wide area. A 10th level wizard casting Fireball, which normally does 10d6 damage in a 20-foot radius, is now 30d6 in a 60-foot radius, centered on the caster. Never mind the wizard, say goodbye to your friends and your ship. If anyone at your table wants to play the meme wizard, a quick jaunt into the phlogiston will whip them into shape in no time.
Apart from behaving like an oily rag, the phlogiston has an additional property when exposed to living beings. Normally, if you shipwreck in wild space, when someone's personal air envelope is used up, they will eventually die of asphyxiation. In the phlogiston, once the air runs out, the living being will be placed in suspended animation. Their flesh will turn grey and stone-like until they're exposed to air, where they'll finally wake up. This makes shipwreck scenarios in the phlogiston really fun and interesting to run.
So to summarize, the universe is like boba tea, delicious, refreshing, and full of interesting flavors. Each boba is a crystal sphere, and each of them contain a unique planetary system inside. And the tea is the phlogiston, the liquid substance in between the crystal spheres. Just like the drink, sometimes the crystal spheres will drift apart, so the distance between them is ever-changing.
Spelljammer lets you travel from one setting to another, so if you want to travel from Krynn to Toril, as they belong in different crystal spheres, you will need to travel through the phlogiston.
The three existing settings are Greyhawk situated in Grey Space, Dragonlance situated in Krynn Space, and Forgotten Realms situated in Realm Space. These three spheres will later be collectively referred to as the Radiant Triangle, being the most traversed. Some spheres are connected via naturally occurring rivers in the phlogiston. Travel times can be sped up exponentially by traveling with the current. For example, a river exists between Realm Space and Grey Space, as well as between Krynn Space and Grey Space, but none exists between Realm Space and Krynn Space. So if you want to travel from Toril to Krynn, it's faster to take a detour to Grey Space via the current than to brave the phlogiston ocean by sailing direct. Plus, GPS hasn't been invented. You're gonna be flying blind. Putting Spelljammer into perspective of the AD&D universe, Faerun is a continent of Forgotten Realms, which is located on the planet Toril, which is part of the planetary system inside the Realm Space crystal sphere, which floats in the phlogiston, which is located on the prime material plane in the greater multiverse.
Spelljammer is obviously a fan favorite setting, but what made it so fondly remembered? If I had to hazard a guess, I would say it's due to the tone of the setting. If I was to describe the tone of Spelljammer in one word, it would be camp.
This word has a million interpretations, so let me explain. The Merriam-Webster dictionary offers this definition. a style or mode of personal creative expression that is absurdly exaggerated and often fuses element of high and popular culture. The keywords here are absurd, meaning ridiculous or silly, and exaggerated, meaning excessively inflated and larger than life. And then the second part of the definition, which takes element of pop culture, can be interpreted as a parody, meaning an exaggerated imitation, or satire, a genre of artistic expression which employs humor and irony, often in context of popular culture. It won't come as a surprise that Spelljammer is a stand-up of the space opera genre of literature. Like popular science fiction contemporaries Star Wars and Star Trek, Spelljammer said, "I'm doing it my way," and has found a fantasy substitute for most sci-fi tropes. Spelljammers can travel at warp speed, magical planetary navigational device, and I'm pretty sure that's the actual Death Star. Yeah, you know how it goes. And then we have the absurd. Only in Spelljammer can you find the GIF, a race of hippo people wearing military regalia with a penchant for firearms and explosives. Try keeping a straight face with this staring at ya. Or the giant space hamster. No, seriously, that's not a garden gnome. This creature had an amusing creation story. This is a gnomish Spelljammer ship called the Sidewheeler. Someone on the design team asked what the big paddle wheel was for. Jeff replied saying that they're hamster wheels. Roger E. Moore, the editor of Dragon magazine at the time, thought it was hilarious, hence hamsters of the giant space variety were added to the setting. This zest for the zany would continue throughout the entire Spelljammer print run. Perhaps Spelljammer, released in 1989, is closer to 1987's Spaceballs than Star Wars, and 1988's Red Dwarf than Star Trek. The 5th edition relaunch of Spelljammer cited 1980's high camp space opera Flash Gordon as inspiration. That about says it all, really.
Now that you're familiar with space, let's introduce you to the locals. And if you're expecting aliens, you're going to be sorely disappointed. While the setting does introduce some new spacefaring creatures, the majority of the populace that you meet are going to be your standard D&D fare. Humans, elves, dwarves, even run-of-the-mill monsters like goblins, undead, and dragons. There's nothing quite like traveling hundreds of thousands of miles away just to meet the same creatures that you did at home. How did they propagate all across the different crystal spheres?
Legend goes that during the dawn of the universe, there was a race of ancients called the Keepers or Zookeepers. They were halfling-sized humanoids with no neck, a barrel body, white eyes, and 3 legs. I said 3 legs. That'll do. And they said AI is going to take over the world. Looks like we've got nothing to worry about.
The Keepers, however, did take over the world.
They traveled the stars, collected a myriad of sentient life, and spread them across fledgling planetary systems like some twisted menagerie.
But that was a long time ago, and they've since either all gone extinct or never existed in the first place. Who's to say? Much more recently, approximately 400 years ago, a conflict of truly intergalactic proportions shook the known universe.
The Unhuman War. The goblinoid races, which include goblins, hobgoblins, kobolds, ogres, bugbears, and orcs, were a dominant presence in space.
They share a trait with the groundling play cousins, being an absolute menace to absolutely everybody.
In the Spelljammer setting, the word groundling is used to refer to people, creatures, or really anything which originated or are native to a terrestrial planet. It is often used in a derogatory manner, implying that the groundling is inferior to a native of wild space. Inversely, the words spacefarer or spaceborn would be used to describe a native of wild space.
So the goblins are the playground bullies, pushing everyone else to defend their homes.
But it was the elves who fought back and declared war against the goblins. Starting with Battle of Cool and Great Space, the Elven Imperial fleet claimed victory after victory, and within a decade decimated half of the goblin population, leaving the survivors scattered and fleeing for their lives, only to be hunted down.
With the elves declared the victors, they would amass the largest Imperial navy in known space, and somehow became even more hoity-toity than their terrestrial cousins. And the goblinoids, if any survived at all, withdrew from the known universe, never to be seen again.
Or were they? Spoilers, this story would continue in future products.
The pseudo-peace has lasted until today. Surprisingly, the different races and cultures mingle far better in space compared to the groundling compatriots. In Spelljammer, the races are divided into major players who hold significant political, military, or economic influences, and the minor players who either tend to follow one of the major players, stick to themselves, or don't have the numbers to be taken seriously.
Having won the largest war in the history of space, the elves are the self-proclaimed guardians tons of wild space. Unlike their reclusive, xenophobic, tree-hugging counterparts on land, space elves are the pick-me show ponies. Their interests include poking their noses in your business and telling you what to do. With the largest imperial fleet, they have the military might to conquer space and be our overlords. Thankfully, they do not have an aggressive warlike disposition. 400 years of being the top dog has not helped with the elven elitism. So in short, pro she's a diva, con she's a diva. The elves have some of the more unique Spelljammer ships which are grown like a tree and are alive, such as their Man-o'-War and the butterfly-like elven armada. Elves maintain bases in space made of interlinked armada ships in a circle formation, and the living ships provide both crops and air for these unique mobile cities. Unsurprisingly, humans are still the most numerous species in space. Many newcomers are groundling humans discovering spelljamming helms from shipwrecks, although most existing groundling cultures have little interest in establishing colonies off-world, as most envoys sent into space end up cutting ties from their groundling routes. Humans tend to build large sprawling cities on asteroids, having a preference for solid ground due to their terrestrial heritage. These cities tend to be communal hubs which foster commerce and culture from all walks of life. Groundling humans' first spelljamming craft tend to be just a regular ship fitted with a helm, like a galleon. Spaceborn humans tend to prefer something a bit more sophisticated like the tradesman. Half-elves are barely mentioned in this setting. Allegedly, they're more common yet don't have their own identity in space. They tend to be accepted into either human or elven society. Space dwarves aren't that different from regular dwarves. They still love underground and mining. But we're in space, you say. What are they mining? Well, look over there. You see an asteroid belt. Dwarves see gargantuan rocks with mineral veins. A clan of dwarves will pick an asteroid to call home and literally hollow out the interior by mining, then craft the material into wondrous items to trade. The dwarves' manufacturing power elevates them to a major player in space. In 2nd edition AD&D, dwarves are considered non-magical, therefore in this setting, they are unable to use spelljamming helms, even though dwarves could become clerics in 2e. Don't ask me why, I didn't write this book. But they have developed a unique alternate power source, the Forge. Mining and crafting generates creative energy, which the Forge then converts into kinetic energy which powers the ship. Oh, and their ship is called a citadel, and it's literally the asteroid they live in. The Forge enables the dwarves to still move through space without a spelljamming helm, but every few years or so they empty out the asteroid completely and need to migrate to a new asteroid and start the whole process all over again. If dwarves cornered the mining industry, what role do gnomes have? Well, in Spelljammer, they're tinkers. Specifically, most gnomes in space descended from Kryn, also known as tinker gnomes or Minoi. There's a Krynish saying, if you want something broken, give it to a gnome. They like to make quote-unquote improvements, but their inventions all have a chance to backfire. Their ship, the gnomish sidewheeler, is one with the infamous hamster wheel, has been modified to be able to make water landings, except there's a 50% chance the ship will just crash on either land or sea. It's also powered by the gnomish helm, which has a chance of breaking without warning. The tinker gnome's incompetence holds them back to being a minor player in space. Both halflings and kender exist in space, but they are few in numbers and do not have their own community. They tend to mingle well with the humans. However, Spelljammer does introduce a new playable race in the lizardmen. Modern D&D players will probably think of them as dragonborn but less cool. They have scaly reptilian skin which doubles as natural armor, providing a natural AC of 5, only benefiting from armor with a superior AC rating and do not gain dexterity bonuses to AC. They can attack with their claws for D2 damage each and tail for D6 damage. As natural weapons, they can attack using all three in a single round, or option to attack with a weapon plus tail, but this counts as 2 weapon fighting with the appropriate penalties. They can become fighters up to 12th level, thieves up to 11th level, and clerics up to 7th level, but unable to multiclass. For whatever reason, the lizardmen have the cons for demi-human level caps without any of the pros of multiclassing. They have infravision up to 60 feet and the movement rate of 6, which is equivalent to short races like dwarves and gnomes, but they also have a swim speed of 12. Lizardmen ships include the squid ship and the hammer ship.
That's all the playable races so far, but there are a few more major players worth talking about.
Mind Flayers, or Illithids, are an iconic D&D monster and they're all over space too. We've all played Baldur's Gate 3. The ship at the beginning of the game is the Nautiloid, the Mind Flayer Spelljammer ship. They also do not use standard spelljamming helms, instead their ship is generally fitted with between 2 to 5 linked helms, where the helmsman can operate simultaneously, adding their powers together to go faster. Even rarer is the Pool Helm, which is reserved for the elite, having come a long way from their landed counterparts whose only motivation is fresh brains. humans. Space Illithids are progressive. They still feel the urge for domination but chose to do it through economics. They are merchants and have built a vast trade network but are considerate enough to not encroach on each other's territory. If there's profit to be made, they will trade with almost anyone, and having a vested interest in customer satisfaction has led them to adapt, as developing a reputation for eating your customers is bad for business. Though they still tend to keep a number of mentally dominated thralls, a number of them lean towards neutral and even an occasional good aligned one who seeks an ethical food source in non-thinking creatures or brains of their enemies. Some build enclaves near human settlements for lucrative brain trading relationships. Bring it back to Baldur's Gate 3 once again. Best Bro Omaluum, who you meet in the Underdark, will be quite welcome in space, as he actively sought out alternative food sources and have interest in other pursuits. Who knew that Baldur's Gate 3 would be such positive representation for Spelljammer? Another classic D&D monster with prominent presence in space is the Beholder. With their myriad of fully functioning eye powers such as the Death Ray, they certainly have the capability to take over space if not for one thing. The book describes it as xenophobia or racism, but that's not entirely correct. See, they have no problems with other creatures, but they harbor deep-seated resentment against their own species. Space Beholders are divided into clans of subspecies with physical or cosmetic differences as trivial as the size of the central eye. Every clan declare that they are the pinnacle of Beholder kind and all other subspecies are to be eliminated, so it's less xenophobia and more tribalism. As a result, they will work with other races, and ships containing both Beholders and humans together is more common than you think. Beholder outcasts or survivors of racial genocide are common and ends up making unlikely friends and allies, as are Beholders with mutated forms or powers. Beholder ships are called the Tyrant ships, which are the most diverse spelljamming vehicles, with each subspecies putting their own variation on the design. They also breed genetically stunted Beholder variants called an Orbis, which has chalky white skin, non-functioning eye stalks, and no teeth. These immature Orbi have a single role. They have a symbiotic relationship with the Tyrant ships and serves as a helmsman. Due to arrested development, they lack self-preservation instincts and the Beholders would rather destroy them than have them fall into enemies' hands. Each ship is led by a Beholder Hive Mother.
Traditionally, both the Mind Flayer and the Beholder play the role of evil villain monstrosities in D&D, but in Spelljammer, they're a lot more nuanced, leaving the seat of irredeemable pure evil vacant. Enter the Neogi.
The Neogi are created specifically for the Spelljammer setting, entirely spaceborne and cannot be found on any terrestrial planets. They look like a cross between moray eels and spiders, and obviously anything spider-like is always evil in D&D. The Neogi are ruthless slayers and slavers, will attack any ship on sight, plunder whatever they can, enslave whoever they can subjugate and eat the rest. The Neogi worldview is owned or be owned. The elite Neogi will own other Neogi, and they in turn own other species. Every Neogi has an Umberhulk slave, and all slaves have the name of their Neogi owner tattooed on their body. Their deplorable reputation has earned them the title of public enemy number 1. Almost every other creature in space despises them. The elves and the dwarves will attack on sight. Only the Mind Flayers are willing to trade with them. Neogi ships include the Death Spider and the Mind Spider. The Neogi also actively use life jammers to power their ship, which is a perverted spelljammer powered by the life force of a living being, literally sucking the victim dry.
There's just one more major player in Spelljammer. They might even be the most important player because they allegedly invented spelljamming. A race of creatures simply known as the Arcane.
The Arcane are blue-skinned humanoid giants about 12 feet tall. They have long faces and slim fingers and dressed in simple robes. These unassuming creatures are an enigma. No one really knows where they come from or how they get around or where they're going. They just seem to hitch a ride on random ships, but no one dare to ask any questions. They're merchants, but they deal almost exclusively in spelljamming ships, helms, and spacefaring equipment. Think of them as the used car salesmen of space. Rumor has it the Arcane are responsible for helping various groundling races soar the skies the first time. After all, Arcane has wares if you have coin. There's literally room for any creatures among the stars that you can find on the ground, like undead, dragons, golems, werebeasts, and there are more original creatures like Gif the Hippo People, Draken the Dragon Centaurs. Dust Sun players will know the Thry Queen, yup, they're here too, the ape-like Hadozi, and more, with some of these being playable in future Spelljammer products.
Okay, I think by now you have a pretty good understanding of Spelljammer, so let's open up the box and see what's inside. This box set was released in 1989 and the retail price was $18 US back then. And for $18, what do you get? Quite a bit actually. So this box set comes with, first of all, there is a strip of plastic. I will show you what that's used for later on. 2 96-page booklets. There are 4 poster maps. And there are around about 20 pieces of cardstock with various artwork and other things printed on there. So I'm going to show you all the miscellaneous material later on in the video when it becomes appropriate. So we're going to have a look at the books first. These 2 books are called Lorebook of the Void and Concordance of Arcane Space. The box set recommends that you read through Concordance of Arcane Space first, so that's what we're going to do. So there is the table of contents. This book then starts with the new concepts being introduced in Spelljammer, such as the celestial bodies, wild space, gravity. These are topics that are already covered at the beginning of this video. So the formatting also includes a sidebar and is printed on the left-hand side of every other page. And the text is carried over across these pages. And often the topic being covered in the sidebar is continued across, say, 5 or 6 pages. So what ends up happening is that you're going to be reading through the main section of the book. And once you finish the text that's in the main section, you would have to flip back to previous pages and reread the pages for the sidebar material, as it covers a different topic to the main pages. So as you see, this then moves on to the multi-sphere churches, while the main pages are still talking about the concept of space, such as temperature, time, and we had like phlogiston. Then the book moves on to character creation in Spelljammer. This is a fairly brief chapter as most of the rules are the same as the player handbook, but it does introduce the lizard men as a new race. There's something that I didn't quite talk about in the previous info dump section of the video, and it relates to how clerical magic functions in space. So as you know, clerics serve their god and they receive their magic from their gods. Now they're able to do that normally in their home world, and the reason for that, gods only have power within a crystal sphere if they have influence within that same crystal sphere. For example, I'm going to use Helm, the Faerunian god from Forgotten Realms. People worship Helm in Faerun, which is contained within realm space. Helm has sufficient influence within realm space to grant spells across the entire sphere. So a cleric of Helm, regardless of where they travel within realm sphere, will have access to their magical powers. However, if the priest leaves realm space and goes to grey space, because no one in grey space worships Helm, Helm has no influence in that sphere. So therefore, cleric of Helm going to grey space would not be able to receive any clerical spells while they're in grey space. And I'll give you another example, cleric of Tyr. So Tyr has influence in realm space. However, Tyr is also part of the Norse pantheon. So if a cleric of Tyr goes to a crystal sphere where the Norse pantheon are worshipped, he will still have a link to Tyr and still able to receive spells. This book introduces some new faiths, not really new faiths, more like new ideas, as we have the polygot, meaning that instead of being a cleric of a specific god, they are a cleric of a certain pantheon. And if the polygot goes to a sphere that has at least one god from the pantheon that they worship, then he is still able to establish a link to the divine. So the additional explanation for these new faiths are explained in the sidebar. So the other new faith option is called the Path and the Way, which is more or less a spacefaring religion. And because it exists in wild space, it's pretty much transferable to every single sphere. And the next new faith is Ptah, who is an Egyptian god who is sometimes credited as the creator of the universe and the god of travelers, and because of that he does have power across every single crystal sphere. So a cleric of Ptah would always be able to maintain a link to their god regardless of whichever sphere that they're in. So obviously these new faiths are really appropriate if you are playing a spaceborne character. If you're playing a groundling character that's found themselves in wild space, then potentially some of these rules about not being able to have a connection to their god will apply. Something else to bear in mind is that in the phlogiston there are no connections to any gods. Regardless of who you worship, you cannot make a link with the divine and hence receive spells until you enter wild space. But this chapter also introduces some new spells for both wizards and priests, and some of these new priest spells will be able to establish a connection with the divine regardless of which crystal sphere that they're in. And the next chapter talks about the Spelljammer ships of wild space. This is a very mechanics heavy chapter as it talks about the different ships, their stats, what they're made of. Most of these ships are made of wood. The maneuverability class, which I will go into in a second.
The Maneuverability class, or MC. Veteran AD&D players should know this, but you could also be playing the game for 30 years without having to ever use it. In AD&D, all flying creatures and objects have a Maneuverability class from A to F, with A being the best and F being the worst. The MC determines the flyer's agility to pivot and turn while in the air, with Class A being able to turn 180 degrees in a single round and each subsequent class being less agile. This is played out on a hex grid, however, as most AD&D players use Theater of the Mind combat, this was a difficult rule to implement. Each ship has an MC stat which will be played out in battle, as you'll see. The size of ships are measured in tons. Not to be confused with the real-life ton or ton, which measures units of mass. The Spelljammer ton is an arbitrary unit of pseudo-mass equivalent to 100 cubic yards, which indicates the size of the object. A ship made of wood and a ship made of stone, provided they're the exact dimension, has the same tonnage in Spelljammer, even though in real life a stone ship would have higher mass. Hull point is hit points for the ship, which measures the total damage the ship can sustain before being destroyed. Hull points can be lost via siege weapons or by regular hit point damage, where 10 hit points of damage to the same area of a ship equals 1 hull point. Armor rating is equivalent to the armor class of the ship in combat. Power type relates to the type of spelljamming helm which allows the ship to move and fly, and is directly related to the ship rating which determines the ship's speed and movement range in tactical combat. I'll briefly summarize the type of spelljamming helms. Minor helms are the most common. This allows the spellcaster to make the spelljammer move and fly as they desire. The ship becomes an extension of their body and they can feel everything inside as well as outside the ship. It's not so much as being able to see the surrounding space. I would liken this to be similar to a sonar scan like a submarine. When using a minor helm, for every 3 levels of the spellcaster, the ship rating is increased by 1. Page 18 in this book states this is rounded up. Hence a level 20 helmsman has a ship rating of 7. However, it directly contradicts this table on page 34, where it's rounded down and the level 20 helmsman has a ship rating of 6. A major helm is a direct upgrade where the ship rating is increased by 1 for every 2 levels and able to power a ship twice the size of a minor helm. To be at maximum speed, the helmsman must have memorized the full repertoire of their daily spells, as each empty slot decreases SR by 1, and by using the helm, the spellcaster immediately loses all spells they've memorized that day, so piloting the ship while slinging spells is not an option. The series helm is a network of between 2 to 5 linked helms used by the mind flayers. When used in conjunction, each helmsman increased the ship rating by 1. Pool helm is for the elite mind flayer ships, serving as an upgrade to the series helm. And Orbis is a living helmsman of the Beholder Tyrant ship, and up to 5 of them can power the ship together similar to the series helm. Forges are invented by dwarves. By mining and creating items, the creative energy powers their citadel. Gnomish helms are gnomish inventions. They have 40% chance of being a dud, and of the ones that do work, there's a 20% chance each time of it just breaking down, so buyers beware. Chronostars contain the power of a minor helm but can be worn over one's head. It is extremely versatile, mobile, and rare.
See, I'm not completely wrong.
Furnaces are a primitive power source and requires burning up magical items to fuel the ship. Another version is called the Outer Furnace. Hand of Vecna going out of control? Throw it in the furnace and kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Life Jammers are the perverted evil version of a Spelljammer helm, as it's fueled by living beings. When placed inside a Life Jammer, the victim will lose hit points each day until it literally sucks the life out of them to power the ship. They're most likely to be used by the Neogi. Lastly, there are non-magical engines, ones powered by science and requires fuel or other alchemical reagents. Their speed is 17 miles per hour, which is not effective compared to the magical power sources, and really only has utility in dead magic space.
And we move on to the Spelljammer ship stats. So I'm going to skip past 2 pages worth of ship stats. As you see, most of this information will be repeated in the second book. Then we have the power sources. So I've just gone through all of the helms already. And then we move on to armaments, which are the ballistics that are used on board these ships. A lot of them are like siege weapons. This is why you're going to see catapults and ballistas, gnomish sweepers, and then you've got rams, because in ship-to-ship combat, ramming attacks actually become effective at certain points. And then we have bombs, jettisons, Greek fire. Now remember, phlogiston is extremely flammable, so a lot of these weapons which produce fire cannot be used in the phlogiston. And then it goes on to other accessories or other improvements that you can make to your ship, and then also improvements to maneuverability. Usually an improvement in armor, such as fortifying your hull, leads to a decreased maneuverability because the ship becomes heavy, and vice versa. So in general, that is a spectrum. So in the second book, it's going to give you the ship stats and the different customizability options. Then we move on to some new personal weapons, and the first thing that's introduces is a pistol. So regardless of whichever setting that you came from, whether it has guns or not, once you get into space, guns become available. They're still quite primitive though, so they're not
necessarily the superior option to traditional weapons. And then under the section for other spell jamming equipment, this is other devices that's going to assist with your spell jamming experience. So a lot of this deals with navigational tools. Some of the items here, for example, the passage device, which allows your Spelljammer ship to pass through the crystal sphere, or it allows you to locate the naturally forming portals in the crystal sphere so that your ship can get through. There's also the planetary locator, which is a star map, more or less. It's kind of like a primitive magic version where it shows you the nearby celestial bodies, so it helps with your navigation. Planetary locator is 2000 GP, but if your players cannot afford that, they can get something a bit cheaper called a star chart. This is more of like a manual map. And in order to make a ship fully functional, you also need to staff it with crew. Now, it is true that most of them can be filled by your party members, but most ships also require more than that. The book then goes into how to recruit the crew for your ship, including their wages and how experienced they are. And there are some rules about training up your crew and the effect that it has with gameplay mechanics. So the more experienced the crew is, the more bonuses that you're going to get. So now we're getting into the nitty-gritty, which talks about the movement and combat. This is also the heaviest section of this book, as in order to run space combat, you really need to read everything and understand all of it and be able to explain all of this to your players as well. So in space, a Spelljammer's movement speed depends on the ship rating, which we just previously talked about. Every point of ship rating is 500 yards per round of movement. So this is your standard movement speed. So for example, a ship that has a ship rating of 5 will be able to move 2,500 yards per round. Remember, second edition, a round is a minute. Most ships also have a secondary movement mode, which is not really named in this book, but it's essentially warp speed. And all of us have seen enough sci-fi films or TV to understand warp speed. So how it works in this setting is if your ship is not within the vicinity of any large body, but it includes most spelljamming ships and planets, asteroids. If these things are not within the vicinity of your ship, you will be able to warp. And traveling at warp speed means 100 million miles per day, regardless of the ship rating. So even if you have a level 1 wizard helming the ship, you will be able to travel at warp speed. So 100 million miles per day is equivalent to traveling from the Earth to the Sun in a single day. And at that speed is approximately 36 days to travel from Earth to Pluto. So that puts it into perspective that even at warp speed, it could still take weeks, if not months, to travel to the edge of a crystal sphere. Now, when your ship approaches something that is of a large body, whether this be another Spelljammer ship or an asteroid, your ship will automatically slow down to tactical speed, which is the speed governed by your ship rating. So you don't have to worry about high-speed collisions, so there is a built-in safety to all of your ships. This book provides you a lot of minutiae with the mechanics. For example, you can work out your takeoff and acceleration speed in the number of rounds. I mean, if that's really what you're into, knock yourself out. Travel speed in the phlogiston is essentially the same as within wild space. As we move into the next section, which talks about combat, I'm going to bring out this map. This is a hex map which was included in the box set. So it just shows the map of space and it's just filled with hexes with pretty much nothing else. And this is pretty much the battle map when it comes to space combat. Within the box set, you also have these cardstock. So what they're intended to be is that you're supposed to cut out the black lines and fold across the dotted line. And then you'll have a cardboard representation of your spelljamming ship. For example, this is clearly a nautiloid. So when you've done that, remember this strip of plastic? These can be snapped off individually, and these become individual standees that you can use to insert the cardboard cutouts of the ships on. And then they essentially become miniature figurines that you can use on the tactical map to play out your ship combat. So in the context of this video, I'm not going to do that, but you get the idea. So these rules will teach you the space combat.
I'm not going to go through all of the mechanics, just a few pieces that I find noteworthy. So one hex on this tactical map represents 500 yards, and each point of your ship rating is also 500 yards. So your ship rating is essentially the number of hexes that you can move each round. Now in counter distance, you actually have to skip ahead almost 15 pages. It is 1d10 plus 10 hexes away. So minimum encounter distance is 11 hexes. Now if you want to, you can try to turn around and try to get away via warp speed. So there are options available if you don't want to engage in combat. In combat, which direction your ship faces is also important. It affects things like maneuverability and also ram attacks. So while you can move the number of hexes equal to your ship rating, bear in mind the maneuverability class of your ship is really important because that decides how sharply you are able to turn. For example, you're encountering a ship 11 hexes away and you're trying to run away ASAP in the opposite direction. A ship that has better maneuverability class is going to be able to turn that 180 degrees a lot sooner and potentially be able to escape in shorter time than a ship with poor maneuverability class. So the different types of ballista and weapon attacks are listed here. Now the helmsman is piloting the ship, so the helmsman cannot do anything else apart from moving the ship. So therefore it's your crew, this could be potentially your other party members, that has the responsibility of using the weapons if you want to do ship-to-ship combat. And a lot of these weapons actually use the character's Thaco stat. You're going to find that warriors and priests are going to be a lot more capable when it comes to using siege weapons than a rogue or a wizard. So the flow of the ship-to-ship combat actually seems like it's closer to 5th edition than it does 2nd edition, because in 2nd edition what happens, they roll initiative after they decide their action, and all of the actions happen pretty much simultaneously in order of initiative. Whereas the ship combat, you roll initiative and it becomes more of a tactical turn where the next person in the initiative gets to take their movement and or action. You can either move first and then act, or act first and then move. And once that ship takes their turn, the next ship that's in the initiative gets to go. So each participant in combat is actually a ship. So let's say that all of your players are on the same ship. The helmsman will roll the initiative, and when it's the player's ship's turn, the crew members can then take their individual turns during your ship's turn. Some of your players might want to fire the ballista, some of them might want to try a spell, and as your ship starts sustaining damage, some of your players might actually want to use their turn to mitigate the ship's damage. For example, fire could actually break out and it will spread unless it's contained. So even though your ship might only act once in the initiative order, every player still gets to take their individual turns on what they want to do. So most of long-range combat involves ballista weapons or missile weapons or spells. There are also critical hits rules. When a ship sustains 50% of its total hull points, it automatically receives a critical hit, and then you roll a d20, and that determines what type of damage that ship has sustained. From fire breaking out inside the ship to helm shock, which is the helmsman needs to make a saving throw or fall unconscious. Essentially, disabling the helmsman means that the ship is unable to move. They can only just drift along in the same direction that they're currently traveling at the same current speed. And then there is short range combat, meaning that your ship needs to be in the adjacent hex to be able to do these maneuvers. For example, you can ram the enemy ship, you can crash into the enemy ship, there are sharing attacks, and you can also grapple onto the other ship and actually board them and then engage melee combat instead. So there are actually a lot of strategic and tactical options when it comes to ship combat. People complaining about 5e Spelljammer not having any ship combat rules, get yourself a digital copy of this book on DM's Guild. You can pretty much run this in 5e without a lot of adjustments because the ship itself have their own individual stats, and the combat and initiative order is already quite similar to 5e anyway, so it's not going to be too different of an adjustment. And then we have running away and pursuit. Repairs. Repairing your Spelljammer ship is extremely expensive as it costs 2,000 gold per day per hull point. So if you lost 10 hull point, that's 20,000 gold and 10 days in order to get your ship repaired. So that's pretty much a very quick summary when it comes to ship combat. The next chapter goes through the mechanics with creating your own crystal spheres. It provides the guidelines and suggestions when it comes to making your own original homebrew worlds if you don't want to use realm space or great space or whatever.
I'm going to come back to this illustration in a bit. So if you want to create your own crystal sphere or your own solar system, these are the guidelines. So there are 7 questions that you need to address. However, if you don't want to create everything yourself, most of this section contains randomly generated tables that you can just employ to generate a star system. Most of this section contains random generation tables that you may use to create your solar system using dice if you prefer. All you have to do is just follow these numbers. So first one is system. This is your planetary system. 1 to 95 standard system is essentially where all the celestial bodies orbit the primary. You have a very small chance of generating something that's different. For example, a fixed system where the planets don't move, or they have random movement, or so on. Part 2 determines what your primary is. Most of the time you're going to get a sun that's going to be in the primary, which is also a fire body. So that's going to be a heliocentric system, but you could also end up with a geocentric system where you could have an earth, air, or water body. Now the elemental bodies I haven't actually gone into because that's the information that's contained on the sidebar, and the elemental bodies are actually on the sidebar of the second book. The format of these books are not really cohesive. Even though this is the book that they recommend that you read first, there's still going to be a lot of information in this book that you don't understand until you read the second book. So I'm just going to go through the elemental bodies quickly. Each celestial body in a planetary system is one of 4 or 5 elemental bodies. Earth body is the most simple. It's just like Earth, it's just like our planet. It's a solid lump of rock that has enough air, has enough water, and has a little bit of fire as well, just like our world. They also tend to be the most common type of planets that you're going to find. Most asteroids that you find are also going to be Earth bodies. So fire body is like our sun. This is going to be a giant ball or other shape. It's going to be predominantly fire. It's going to be very hot, and really only creatures that can exist in a fiery environment can survive there, like elementals or salamander. And then you have air bodies, which is predominantly air. Now this could be a gas giant like Jupiter or Saturn within our own solar system, but it doesn't need to have a rocky core. It can just be completely air, and that's possible as well. And then you also have the water body, which is just like a giant ball of water. Sometimes you could find that there's like an earthen core at the center of the planet. Doesn't have to happen. Sometimes it's ice. And then there is also a 5th type, which is called the plant type. Some sages lump the plant type into the earth type, but certain cultures will consider that being a 5th element. So plant types are more or less a living planet. The planet itself is alive. Think of like Yggdrasil as a planet, for example. And then you generate the number of planets, planetary motion, and then next is planetary characteristics. So this is when you go through each of the celestial body in that planetary system and determine that planet type. And there it is, life world, which is the 5th element that I was talking about. And then you can determine the size of the planets. Now they are ordered by alphabet, and the key to this is on a sidebar over here, and it tells you what the different sizes are. And this is the annoying thing about the format of this book, is that some of the information is going to be available on the sidebar. And then you've also got the planet shapes as well. So we have amorphous or flexible shape. So this is just like some random shape. Belt or smaller objects in a single orbit. This is like the asteroid belt. A cluster of smaller objects within a small area. A spherical, a cubical shape, a flat world, elliptical shape, and then even stranger ones. And then I think what's also interesting is that if you skip a couple of pages, the sidebar actually lists our own solar system and how we will classify the different planets in our system using this type. The sun is a type H fire type body. Venus, Earth, and Mars all fits within the type E specifications, and they're Earth bodies. When we move on to the gas giants, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune are considered air bodies. And then there's the asteroid belt, which is classified as an Earth belt. And then the cometary belt, which is considered an air belt. And this is how you can use these tables to run randomly generated planets and celestial bodies. So moving back to this illustration, this is the world turtle cosmology, where you have the world being held up by 4 elephants on the back of a giant turtle. Instead of using a geocentric or heliocentric star system, you can actually use something that's unique for your crystal sphere. You could actually have the world turtle and elephants holding up the planets. So the next section that we come into is the spell effects, text, which is talks about how the different spells are affected in space. So most of the changes to these spells aren't really unique to that spell itself, more to do with the conditions of space. So for example, anything to do with fire is altered in the phlogiston. Anything to do with a cloud or mist, or anything to do with air will have implications when it comes to the air quality of your ship. Like, you don't want to cast stinking cloud on board a ship. Anything to do with sound cannot travel in the vacuum of wild space. Anything that deals with gravity has implications to the gravitational field in space. Any spell which makes a connection with the divine cannot function in a crystal sphere that does not have the link to that pantheon. And any spells which makes connection to the divine or involves traveling to or from another plane cannot work in the phlogiston, because the phlogiston does not connect to the other planes. And there are some spells which can be used to directly inflict damage to a Spelljammer ship, for example, disintegrate. And then the next section, we have some tables which measures the travel distance between the planets. For reference, the first table provides the data for our very own solar system, just in case you want to compare the distance between our own planets versus the one that you created. It provides the distance in both miles as well as travel times. And the two tables, the differences are the distance between two planets at the shortest distance and also the longest distance as the planets move. The distance that they are in relation to each other constantly changes. And we're also provided the same information for the other three crystal spheres in the radiant triangle. We have gray space, realm space, and crin space. And then the next page is the planetary display. Now I'm going to whip out another poster. This is the second poster in this box set. So we have the two circle graphs, the large and the small one. There duplicates the same image as we had on the book. What's also been provided are the maps for gray space, realm space, and crin space. You can think of this like a galactic hex map. This is a template for you to create your own solar system and where the planets are in relation to each other. And the reason why we're given two large circle graphs is because we have an inner part and an outer part, and they are scaled differently. So this entire inner grid fits into one space in the larger outer grid. And the reason for this is that typically in a solar system, the inner planets are closer to each other, and the further out the planets get, the distance between them and the center of the solar system gets exponentially larger. So breaking it into two separate grids lets you use two separate scales. So this will let you have more planets that are closer to the center of the solar system. So if you were to place all the planets on a linear scale, this map will need to be the size of my room. And then on the lower right, you have a table for the planetary display map. So this table gives you room to put in 20 different planets, their size, shape, and type. And the box also comes with this piece of cardstock, which is designed to be used with this map. We have the planet sizes, the planet shapes, as well as the planet types, as in the elemental types of the planet. So you can cut these out, put them onto the standee, and lay the different planets out on the standee on this map as kind of like a three-dimensional star map kind of thing when you're traveling in between the planets. And if you don't want to use the poster map, you can just stick to the format that's been provided in the book. You can just photocopy these two pages or have them printed out and just draw it on the paper graph. And then the final 3 pages, we have a little bit of a write-up on the Rock of Brawl. If you know a little bit about Spelljammer, or if you played either the 2nd or the 5th edition of this setting, you will likely have heard of the Rock of Brawl. So the Rock of Brawl is the most famous city in the Spelljammer setting, arguably the only noteworthy city in Spelljammer. There are towns and cities that's introduced in an adventure, but typically they just are used for that adventure and don't appear again. Whereas this Rock of Brawl is kind of like what the designers intended for you to be a starting city. It's the only city in the setting that's given any level of expansion. It's kind of like Spelljammer's version of Waterdeep from Forgotten Realms or Sigil from Planescape. The Rock of Brawl is a human city which is located on an asteroid. It is not very big, it's only about a mile long. It provides you a summary of the history of this city, the lineage of kings who've ruled the city previously. This then goes on to talk about the different districts and places in the city that you can explore. So you can start your adventures in the city. There's plenty of places in the city that you can adventure to. There are also like caverns and dungeons. There is a lake, there are shops, graveyard, festival ground, temples, markets, essentially all of the amenities that a large city will have. Rock of Brawl will have it, but with a spin to it. One of the most interesting things that people remember Rock of Brawl for, there is a bar where the bartender is a beholder. I believe this is the illustration. The beholder's name is Large Luigi. He is a friendly barkeep. His powers are kind of mutated. So instead of having like death rays, he has the power to detect lies, and he uses it to keep peace in the bar. And he also uses his telekinesis eye beams to mix drinks. That's going to be a really fun NPC. You can just see by this illustration what the kind of shenanigans that goes on. So there is some strong guy who is having a fist fight with another beholder, and then you've got a mind flayer who is sharing a drink with a human. So it's really nice to see in this setting where normally beholders and mind flayers will be treated as monsters, they're just hanging out and relaxing with the humans and the other people. There's another piece of map that I just want to show. This is the map of the Rock of Brawl. So on the top left, we have a side view cross section of the asteroid. You see the gravity plane is this horizontal line right across the center, the middle of the asteroid. And the asteroid is divided to the upside and the underside. So we have the Princess Castle, High City, Low City, and underside of the city we have the naval base and the citadel. And then within the asteroid, there is like some underground caverns. And this lake is really interesting because the lake is on both sides just because of how gravity works. The water is attracted to the center of the asteroid. And the map of the city, I believe, only really shows the upside. There isn't a map for the underside of the city, but it gives you all the districts up here. And here is the lake. And the Princess Castle is on the secluded side, fenced off. So even though the city only got 3 pages worth of write-up, the map really helps in trying to run a game in the city, as even the locations that's been presented on this map, you can go and create these districts just by the name of these places. So for example, you've got Give Town, so you can imagine this is the place where the Give lives. So this will be the place where you have like gunsmiths and explosive experts. You know, you could have a quest where you need to get underground and then you find that the entrance has been sealed off. There was a cave-in or something and sealed off one of the passageways, and they need to get some dynamite. Well, where do you get that? Well, obviously the GIF. So you can use that to inspire you to create some storylines. And since we're looking at posters, I might as well show you the very last one. There isn't really going to be a best time to bring this up, so I'm just going to do it now. And the final map is actually a map of the Spelljammer, the legendary ship. So the legendary Spelljammer looks like a manta ray, and it's a gigantic ship. It's also been incorporated into the Spelljammer logo. So the size of this ship is like the entire size of this poster, and we have a nautiloid. This gives you an idea of the scale and the size of this map. The stats for the ship has also been provided. This base box actually has very little information on the Spelljammer. So there is a little bit of write-up here, and there's a little bit of write-up in the page book. As a matter of fact, I think this might actually be the same text. Even as you read the write-up, it actually poses more questions than answers, like where did the Spelljammer come from, who built it, and for what purpose, blah blah blah. And on the bottom right of the poster, we are provided with a side view of the Spelljammer, so you can see that there is an entire city on its back. So I don't really think that this is sufficient information to run the Spelljammer. We know that this is a city on a ship, and no one has really seen the ship. Anybody who's seen the ship can't really provide any evidence of it. It's all really hearsay. I believe the second box set that's released for Spelljammer, the one after this, is called The Legend of Spelljammer, which covers the ship. That's going to be the content for another video. So that is book 1. Let's move on to book 2. Now we can move on to the second book called Lore Book of the Void. So I believe this book is supposed to be more of a lore book, but as you're going to see for yourself, there's also a fair bit of mechanics in here as well, and a fair bit of information that was repeated from the first book. It provides you with around 10 ideas or so about how to take your D&D game, which is currently located on a groundling world, into space. For example, your party has the scroll of create minor helm and go into space that way, or they can meet an NPC, an alien from another world, or discover a crash site. And then the book also does the same thing, provides you about 5 or 6 ideas on how to start a spaceborne adventure. This will be an adventure where all of your player characters are spaceborne. They already know about the lore with wild space and all of the different races and technology and all that. And then it goes into what type of creatures that you typically find in each of these worlds, divided by the elemental types. And remember, this is 1989, the same year that second edition was launched. So it was severely lacking in monster options, so it provides you some ideas on how to convert first edition monsters into second edition, giving you ideas on variations that you could do to make them a bit more spaceborne. And it basically recommends that you reskin a lot of the monsters, so you can keep the same monster statistics and just reflavor it. So you can use, for example, the stats for a hellhound and say that it's a space dog or space wolf, something like that. And then for chapter 2, the book moves on to the different types of spelljammers. And if you're experiencing a case of deja vu right about now, yes, there was a section in the previous book which outlined the ship stats, but this book gives you information on what type of activities or purpose these ships typically serve. Like you can see, this section says ship users, and there are a few different scenarios on when these ships will be employed. You see on the page is a flitter. It looks like a ship with butterfly wings, and this is an elven ship, because all the elven ships have wings that's made of a living material because they're supposedly grown rather than made. So the flitter is a single man ship, and it only has a single hull point, so it's not really designed for combat. The users are a messenger, so this would be like during wartime that they would just send a single ship for speed to deliver a message or scouting and reconnaissance work. And these ships can also be employed by small fighters. It kind of reminds me of like in Star Wars when Luke had to infiltrate the Death Star and he was piloting a jet that only has a single seat, so that's the idea of the flitter. So I think there are around about 20 or so ships in this book. Artwork has been provided for most of them, but not all of them. Different races and different cultures tend to have their own ship that they prefer. Like for example, the Wasp is built by lizard men and used primarily by lizard men and humans. So the way that I think of these ships is like if Spelljamming the setting is a video game like Gran Turismo, the ships are the different cars, because obviously that's a great draw for a game like Gran Turismo. People play it because they can try out their favorite car or discover a lot of different cars that they like. So for someone who's really into cars, Gran Turismo or other racing games will be something that appeals to them. Well, the ships in this setting are the same kind of thing. So in the base box, you are introduced to 20 different ships, and then in almost every single subsequent Spelljammer release, new ships are added to the mix. So I kind of think of the supplement Spelljammer releases like DLC packs, as each subsequent supplement or expansion will provide more ships to the mix to really get you engaged and get you to want to buy that new product. So like I said, there are a lot of ships in this book, and yet 20 ships is only a small fraction in the total number of ships in this setting, as many more will be introduced later on. Now before we move any further, I just want to show you these art cards that came with the pack. I've already shown you these 4, which are the cardboard cutouts of the ship models and the planet models that you can use with the standee on the tactical battle map or the tactical planetary map. So the remaining cards essentially have the artwork and also the ship stats on them. So I don't really understand the logic behind what they've done, as not all of the ships are available on these cards. And in this pile of cards, they printed 2 for each ship, whereas they've only provided 1 each for the Neogi Mind Spider and the Death Spider. So these are obviously the ships used by the Neogi. The Death Spider is the bigger ship, as its size is 100 tons, versus the Mind Spider, which is a smaller ship at 40 tons. And then we move on to the pile with doubles, and this one is the Hammer ship, which is used by humans and lizards. The lizard men tend to like ships that are inspired by fish. Speaking of fish, the next one is called the Squid ship, which is also used by lizard men, even if they're made by humans. And then the next one is the Tradesman, which is a stock standard spelljamming ship for humans. This tends to be a trading vehicle as it's fairly lightly armed.
And then the next one is the Dragonfly. Ships modeled after insects are also quite common, and all you Baldur's Gate 3 players, which is probably all of you, should recognize this one, the Nautiloid, which as you know is primarily used by mind flayers. And in my opinion, when I think of Spelljammer, the Nautiloid is the first thing that comes to my mind. So the next one is the Dragon Ship, which is a Chinese-inspired ship. So set in the lore that most human cultures are not interested in space exploration, except for Karator, specifically the kingdom of Shorlung, as they do maintain quite a significant presence in space, and these are the ships that they use. There is the Wasp, which are used by lizardmen and humans. And this is the Man-O-War, the typical elven battleship. As mentioned earlier, they have the largest fleet, and the wings are organic and growing like a tree. And then we have the Galleon, which looks like a ship that we had back in the 1600s in real life, as these are typically used by groundling humans. One of the ideas the book gives you on how to move your D&D campaign into space is if your characters find a scroll of Create Minor Helm, they use the spell Create a Helm and then secure it on a regular ship, and the ship will now be able to fly. And within the lore of this setting, this is typically how groundling humans get into space in the first place. So there are quite a few noteworthy omissions. For example, the Dwarven Citadel, this is the one where they take over an entire asteroid. The Elven Armada, which are their largest battleships, very heavily armed. And then there's the Gnomish Sidewheeler, the famous hamster wheel, which is also not included in the art cards. And then finally, it provides a little bit of information on the legendary Spelljammer ship. And then we have some more regurgitated information about the different types of helms. The writer could have saved a lot of space by consolidating the information which contained in both of these books and have them just in one place. I think if they did that, they'll have many more pages to work with and could include more lore. Because when it comes to lore, this setting is quite sparse. But from reading Jeff's blog, it sounded like his main concern was actually filling these 2 lots of 96-page books. Maybe he started running out of things to say, and then he was just like filling up space for the sake of filling up space. The book then moves on to the races in space. We have major races and minor races, which are explained on the sidebar. And with the description of humans, there are quite a few factions that are mentioned. For example, the schools of magic rose galleries. So these are kind of like guilds for thieves and mages. Adventuring companies, trading companies. So the information that's contained in this section are very brief and very broad. I don't think it does much to give a unique point of view for these factions. They're just like a guild for the sake of being a guild. On the last page, it introduces 2 other human-centric groups, which play a bit of a slightly larger role in this setting. So we had the Seekers, which are a group dedicated to knowledge. They're kind of like sages that wants to collect all the information about space. And then the rival organization is called the Xenos with an X. And as the name would imply, this group is made up of xenophobic humans who thinks that space belongs to the humans and all the other races are unworthy. Then we go through the other races, elves, dwarves, lizard men. A mention of the goblinoid races, most of them have been wiped out from the first Unhuman War, and almost a full-page write-up on the Mind Flayers. As you can appreciate, prior to this point, when you say Mind Flayers, most players will have some pretty well-formed ideas on what Mind Flayers are, so Spelljammer's doing a lot of work trying to break down that stereotype of Mind Flayers being monstrous and giving them a lot more nuance. So the undead actually has a decent presence in space, given that they don't need to breathe, they don't need air, but they can freely travel the vacuum and phlogiston pretty much safely. There's some really interesting ideas here, particularly with the non-corporeal undead like wraiths and ghosts. You can do a ghost ship trope in space. And then also the idea that incorporeal undead, when they're outside of a gravitational field, would just float in space until something comes by, and this undead will be pulled to the ship's gravity. I love this idea of like you're just minding your business, traveling the space, and unexpectedly picks up a hitchhiker ghost. So remember how I was talking about the world turtle cosmology with the world being held up by 4 elephants standing on a giant turtle? So these animals are called star beasts. And apparently they're sentient beings, and in this book it provides you with many more ideas on how you can create your own unique crystal spheres involving star beasts. We also have some new monster entries. These are unique to the Spelljammer setting. So there's the Arcane, and then the Beholder, which is an existing monster, but they're rewriting the Beholder in reference to Spelljammer. And this creature on the right is what they call an Orbis for singular, or Orbi as plural. So they're bred to be completely docile so that they can act as the ship's helmsman. That's why their eye stalks have no actual eyes on them, and they're non-functioning. So they're pretty much completely docile and harmless.
And the big one is the Hive Mother. In future products, and I'm not just talking about Spelljammer, this is like all TSR products, they would separate the monster entries into its separate booklet or loose leaf pages. But obviously at this time, they haven't figured out what they want to do. There is the gift. This is the original piece of artwork with the helper with a gun. And then here is the Nyogi, another large presence. They're the villains of Spelljammer. And as we're nearing the end, this section is called Known Spheres, and essentially it provides information on the 3 spheres of the Radiant Triangle. So there is Kryn Space. It goes through all of the celestial bodies within that crystal sphere. It provides a brief description of each of the planets, what the physical conditions are like, what type of creatures exist on there, and a smaller number of these have an existing culture of humanoids living on them. But just from reading these entries, it seems like most of these planets are largely uninhibited by humanoids. And if you look at the sidebar, they're talking about the elemental world again. So part 5 live world, this is the optional 5th element. If you flip to earlier sections, it goes through the other elements. But there's really a severe lack of cohesion, because then it moves on to creation of the universe, and then major and minor races, and then the adventurer who fell to Earth, and then it goes into the air worlds, separated by a large section of the monstrous entries which have no sidebar, before moving back to part 5 live worlds. It's like the sidebars divided without any rhyme or reason either, and literally there are 3 places across both books where it talks about the different elemental worlds. So I think that this is a terrible choice, because you don't actually get the complete idea on all of these elemental worlds unless you fully read through both books. So once again, all of this information could just be collated into a single place. So the pages went through Kryn Space, Grey Space, and then Realm Space, and this is the end of it.
The print run for Spelljammer went from 1989 to 1993. During these 4 years, 19 Spelljammer products were released. While this video primarily focuses on the base box, here is a preview of the future products to come.
Spelljammer DM screen. In future campaign settings, the DM screen will be included in the base box. Lost Ships feels like an expansion of the base box with more stuff, new monsters, spells, ships, and rules. Realm Space, Grey Space, and Kryn Space expands on each of the crystal spheres in the Radiant Triangle. Rocket Brawl expands on the hub city Rocket Brawl, except the poster map provided remains unchanged. Practical Planetology and Space Layers provides pre-designed planets and dungeons respectively, with established lore and quest hooks you can drop in your game. Complete Spacefarer's Handbook provides many new player options, new playable races, kits, proficiencies, equipment, and factions. Monstrous Compendium Appendices 1 and 2, more monsters for your Spelljammer game. The Legend of Spelljammer, box set which expands on the legendary ship Spelljammer, covering its purpose, mystery, and comes with an adventure. War Captain's Companion, box set which contains miscellaneous expansions such as rules to build your own ship, shipbuilding companies in various spheres, stats of warships released thus far, expansion on space combat, and even a board game. Astral Mundi Cluster, box set which introduces Cluster Space, a sealed crystal sphere where you can get in but cannot get out, has existing factions and politics, and introduces fiends to Spelljammer. World Space, Skull and Crossbows, Crystal Spheres, and Under the Dark Fist. These 4 unrelated adventures with their own storyline can be run in succession and introduces new crystal spheres to the setting. Spelljammer adventures are also written to be more sandboxy than other 2E adventures at the time. Goblins Return and Heart of the Enemy. These 2 adventures are connected as the Goblinoids are back with a vengeance and starts the second Unhuman War.
Now I'm going to tell you what I think. These are just my opinions, so if you disagree, don't listen to me. I'm just some rando on the internet who talks funny. I'll start with the good. I mean, what can I say that hasn't already been said? Spelljammer has a stellar reputation. Its creativity is 11 out of 10 off the charts. It's batshit crazy what's in here. Space vampires? Giant undead insects the elves use as Gundam suits for war. Failed liches doomed to fly around space as a ball of fire? Even the idea of fantasy space was wholly unique in 1989, and it still is today. There are very few limits, and the setting plays into that. If you have an idea that you think, maybe it's a bit much, it doesn't fit the tone of my game, it can probably work in Spelljammer. After all, the sky is the limit. But I think this is also its detriment. When everything is special, nothing is special. Spelljammer walks a very tight rope between creative and crass, between stupendous and stupid, and between that's the coolest thing ever and who thinks of this shit? Often both. For every good original monster design, we have a low effort one, like draw a face onto something and call it a thing, or take an existing sci-fi thing and call it something else. For example, that is a living creature. The setting's propensity for humor and the absurd means that you might be a burp away from the session devolving into slapstick buffoonery and toilet humor. But hey, I'm not here to kink shame anybody. If that's what you're into, that's totally cool with me. But some of us prefer our games to be a little more serious. It's hard to take the goblin invasion seriously when you spent the last 2 hours weed whacking on the back of a colossus floating through space, all because he hasn't bathed in a while. His name is Gump, by the way, and yes, this is an official adventure. Moving on, Spelljammer is obviously inspired by space opera media like Star Trek, except something got lost in translation when they went from sci-fi to fantasy. Communication. In space, whenever they encounter another ship, they open up the comms channel and FaceTime the other ship on the big TV screen with real-time communication. Did you notice when we looked through the list of ship accoutrements, communication device was not one of them? After looking through some old Spelljammer forums, it seems, rules as written, ship-to-ship communication did not exist. Bear in mind, minimum encounter distance is 5,500 yards, which is just over 3 miles or 5 kilometers. The only way to communicate is via magic, and this can't be the helmsman because remember, the helmsman instantly loses all of their memorized spells upon using the helm, so you need another spellcaster on board. Clairvoyance and clairaudience could work as one-way communication. Sending a 5th level spell only works if you already know the target. I flipped through the player's handbook looking for a spell that could work in this scenario, and I came away with Wish. And as for the reason why communication is so difficult, we need to understand the origin and purpose of Dungeons & Dragons. D&D has its roots in historical wargaming, bringing in the fantasy element as inspired by Tolkien, but at its heart it's still very much stuck in the Middle Ages, with technology to match. Instant communication across vast distances has huge implications when it comes to war, economics, politics, espionage. After all, information is power, and this is not the lane that D&D wants to play in. I was not able to find anywhere where Jeff Grubb talked about communication in Spelljammer. I also didn't look very hard, I'm not running an investigative journalism channel, but I did find this clip from Ed Greenwood's YouTube channel where he spoke about sending stones in the D&D movie.
In my original, sending stones come in matched pairs, through which a bearer can cast a spell that sends a 25-word or less message to the holder of the other stone. And the moment this single message is sent, both stones are useless until next morning. And you could say, well, who cares? If you allow that at your gaming table, your characters or anyone else, like the bad guys, to have cell phones that they can talk freely back and forth, guess what? You can never have a secret again. Your army can never sneak up on somebody again. Every merchant will know to adjust their prices instantly when there's a shortage half a continent away. In other words, all the bad crap of modern real-world society will be dumped into your fantasy setting.
I'll put the link to the full video in the description, but you guys should check out Ed's channel, he's got a lot of cool stuff on it. It's worth noting that Ed and Jeff both worked at TSR during this time. As a matter of fact, Ed and Jeff collaborated on the Forgotten Realms campaign setting released in 1987. It could be inferred that TSR writing staff had similar stances on communication. Bear in mind, Spelljammer had to be compatible with the other 3 settings. So you encounter a ship, you don't know whether it's a friend or a foe, you don't have a proper way to make contact. Doesn't sound very fun, does it? Some players use flags or flares, which is similar to how real-life sailors communicated, but still very limited. Other DMs just hand-waved this and gave the players ship-to-ship communication for both quality of life and also this is just what we've come to expect from this genre. At some point during your space odyssey, you might want to go for a jaunt in a more conventional setting. Maybe swing by Oath to see how Furiondi's doing. A change of pace could give you the chance to steer the game towards a more serious tone, but do be careful, as this could be a way for Spelljammer baggage to sneak into a traditional setting. If you've given your players real-time communication, that opens the door to it being normalized. Spelljammers are so fast, so why not take it to get to the other continents? Going from Ansalon to Taladas will be a breeze. And what role could Spelljammers play in terrestrial warfare? We have guns in space. How do you feel about having it exported to Faerun? And even if we leave out the specifics, there's also the issue of introducing space economics to groundling economy. To put things into perspective, a miner helm, the most basic thing which every ship has, costs 100,000 gold pieces. With the ship and the other equipment potentially costing another 50, it costs 2,000 gold pieces to repair a single hull point. This is the level of economics that Spelljammer plays with, which implies rewards need to be on a level where this expense is considered normal, and you're bringing that to the groundling economy. If you started your adventure in space, it's probably not that big of a deal. After all, getting stranded on a primitive planet is just your weekly episode of Star Trek. And there's always the age-old technique of lying your pants off. I didn't see any strange ship. I have amnesia. What's a ship? But if you started your adventure on land and then moved to the stars, don't expect the stakes to stay the same. You know the saying. Once they've seen the phlogiston, how do you expect them to look at Fireball the same way? Although, to be fair, space travel's not common knowledge, but I don't buy the idea that grounding nations are not interested in space exploration like the way that the book's trying to sell me. I mean, after seeing how much wealth is out there? But then again, D&D needs to keep its technological advancements to a minimum to preserve the setting. I get that. After all, if NPCs were competent, we'd all be out of a job. Look, seriously, it's not that hard to work around it as a DM, but just realize that your players might try to abuse it. You must take the treacherous journey to Winterdale by crossing the Vale of Swords. I'll take my ship, I'll be there in a jiffy. The journey to Mustika is 40 days and 40 nights. Are you ready? I'll take my ship, I'll be there before lunch. Elvira's castle is in the sky. To get there, you must convince the Pegasus riders to aid you. I'll just take my ship. You can't. It was confiscated by the city of Waterdeep for unpaid parking tickets. Oh, just pay for a teleport. I give up. Actually, I got one other thing. There's far too much mess in this product. Everything can be dissected down to the minutiae. Spelljammer takeoff time determined by size of planet, modified by weather conditions, determined by seasons, and dice to include 1d8 rounds warm-up, takeoff and landing times with 4 methods of calculation, classifications of crew based on experience, up and downgradable variable salaries, and combat prowess 5 minutes later. With 2 methods of calculating ship air quality due to overcrowding and the exchange of air when 2 bodies meet. It's all too much. Trust me, when an Asian person tells you have too much math, you have too much math.
Now let's go through the pros and cons. Pro: unique premise of fantasy space that you can't find anywhere else. Off-the-wall creativity guaranteed to show you something you've never seen before. Refreshingly eccentric tone but still able to deliver moments of gravitas. Versatile setting that can be stretched to incorporate many genres and cross over to other settings with ease. Cons: setting could easily slip into slapstick silliness or lowbrow humor, depending on your group. Could take effort on the DM's part to not have your campaign bulldozed over by campy fun. Could bring Spelljammer baggage into more traditional fantasy settings if not careful. Remember, once you open Pandora's box, it's difficult to put the lid back on. DMs may need to be firm on what Spelljammer-isms are allowed to be transported to ground. Held back by limited world building, especially for such a high concept setting, you may need to create much of the lore yourself. Presentation is extremely bland in comparison to other 2nd edition settings, with sparse amount of black and white artwork.
Now we're gonna have to address the elephant in the room. Often, when people talk about Spelljammer, Planescape generally gets brought up sooner or later. It seems like D&D fans cannot dissociate these two settings, not in a negative way mind you, but it's usually about how similar these two settings are, so let's talk about it. By the way, I'm YouTube's #1 Planescape fan, so you know this section is going to be biased.
There are many similarities between Spelljammer and Planescape. Firstly, both settings are themed around places and subjects that are irreverent, esoteric, ethereal, and otherworldly. Too many big words? I need the current catch-all word. Ah, there it is. Secondly, their utility in the overall TSR ecosystem being that they connect other more popular settings together. Thirdly, Spelljammer's print run was between 1989 and 1993, while Planescape's print run was from 1994 to 1998.
Wait, one of them started when the other one ended? Interesting. Many fans were under the impression that Spelljammer was superseded by Planescape given their similar themes and purpose. Conspiracy theories aside though, do you remember the TSR staff meeting of 1988 at the start of this video? The meeting ended with Jeff Grubb getting to write Spelljammer and David Zeb Cook getting to write Dragonlance Time of Dragons. Zeb would later go on to create Planescape in 1994. Jeff and Zeb are obviously different writers with different styles, and that came across in their writing. When creating a setting, certain questions must be answered.
What? When, where, who, why, and how. Jeff was more concerned with the what and how part of Spelljammer, while Zeb was more concerned over the where, who, and why aspect of Planescape. Therefore, while the two settings have similar themes, what really stuck out to me was the purpose of the product and by extension, the setting. Spelljammer was extremely dedicated to the rules, the mass, planetary system tables, tactical space combat rules, even if at times the rules contradicted each other. Jeff was so dedicated to using up space that the ship stats were printed 4 times so you know what's going on. It also goes into depth about how space this works. The various new concepts like wild space, gravity, air, phlogiston, spelljamming helms all addressed in a satisfactory manner. As for Planescape, I'll be making a full video eventually, but in the context of comparison with Spelljammer, Planescape has a lot of who's who and movers and shakers. The 15 factions and their leaders, for example, all very relevant NPCs. For Spelljammer, there's maybe 3 NPCs if you can call it that. A couple of the princes of Rock or Brawl were named, and Large Luigi was mentioned in a throwaway line.
Spelljammer had 3 pages devoted to its hub city Rock or Brawl. Planescape had 37 pages on Sigil.
Planescape has many more places to visit than Spelljammer, so it obviously couldn't give you that much details. So the planets of Spelljammer and each layer of a plane is given around the same detail. It's just that Planescape has many layers and many planes.
The essence of Planescape is about answering the why. Why is the multiverse the way it is? Why do people worship gods? The whole shtick with the setting is about differing philosophies, and if you play for long enough, you'll find that there is an answer for everything. Alright, so you're thinking, what's their writing style got to do with anything? Well, Spelljammer is more interested in being a game first. Games have rules. Rules for the world that you can interact with, which makes the game fun. And repeat, there's not a lot of lore or world building because it invites you to do some of the work, which is why it gives you the rules to generate your own world. For more game, Planescape is more interested in being a concept first. It stretches your imagination on metaphysical things like beliefs and philosophy, but most people will look at it and go, well, that's all very nice, but what do I do with it? I'll give you an example. Travel time in Spelljammer can be measured right down to the minute. Planar travel, on the other hand, is whatever. You just pick a direction, start walking, you'll get there when you get there. What does that even mean? The book doesn't tell you. So I had a player in my game. He's a professional DM for 10 years and he plays like 4 games a week. He told me that he's never used the planes in his game because he didn't know how to run them. So this is a guy who has significantly more practical DMing experience than me, telling me that he didn't know how to run the planes. And I think that's why you see so many people consume Planescape lore like creative fiction who's never played the game, and there are channels much more successful than mine covering planar lore. And I'll ask you this, how many Spelljammer lore videos do you see? What I'm saying is, while they may look very similar, they feel very distinct but complement each other. Not saying which is better, obviously Planescape, but both are awesome and deserves to be played. Going back in time to the TSR staff meeting of 1988 one last time. Imagine an alternate timeline where Zeb got to write Spelljammer. It would have been very different to the Spelljammer that we got, but I, for one, would gladly trade space combat rules for rich world building and faction intrigue. As for my final thoughts, I like Spelljammer, but it doesn't really inspire me. It took me 3 weeks to work out an angle for this video. I love the concept, I love the world, except there's not much to it as the set strongly encourages you to create your own. It's not until 1993 in the Astral Mundi cluster where Spelljammer would finally receive a fleshed out campaign setting in cluster space. This is an ancient crystal sphere where you can easily get in but can't get out, a bit like Ravenloft in space. With established factions and politics, that's really interesting, and that was the last Spelljammer product. The line ended when it was just getting good. I can see myself running a Spelljammer game, though it'll probably be an extension to Planescape as these two settings can coexist together, and I prefer the metaphysics of Planescape more. Sigil's connected to the Rock or Brawl, and remember, you cannot plane travel to or from the phlogiston, so Planescape does not make Spelljammer obsolete, and the zaniness could work as a foil to Planescape's heavy philosophy, acting kind of like an intermission to the key story beats. If I start a terrestrial game, I'd be wary of the shift in tone and curate the part of Spelljammer that I would let back on land to preserve the setting. It is possible to run a more serious Spelljammer game, you just have to commit as a DM and don't treat the world like a caricature. And that brings us to the end of the episode. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know your most memorable Spelljammer moments down in the comments. Remember to like and subscribe and let me know what setting you would like me to cover. Until next time, hope we get to hang out again in my next video.